She stood in my yard with a clipboard and a smirk. "This tree violates code. Cut it, or we will." Behind her, the city truck idled, chainsaw ready. But what she didn't know, I'm the one who wrote that code. And that oak? It's older than the HOA itself. They picked the wrong guy. My name's Darren Holt. I'm 52 years old, and I've been working with trees longer than most HOA board members have been alive. I'm not just passionate about them. I've made it my life's work. I'm the head arborist for the county. I've planted redwoods after wildfires. I've cataloged heritage oaks that stood since the 1700s. I've taught high school kids how to graft apple saplings and watched those same trees bear fruit 10 years later. But this tree, the one they tried to cut down, that one's personal. My daughter was born the year I planted it. We used to mark her height on the bark, year after year. We hung swings from its limbs, built a bench around the trunk, and every fall we'd rake up the leaves together. That tree is more than wood and roots. It's family history. So when an HOA enforcer came barking about unapproved canopy size, I didn't just hear a threat to my tree. I heard a threat to everything it stood for: patience, legacy, home. And the irony? The law they cited was misread, misquoted, and unenforceable. I know that because I helped write it. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had to stand your ground for something that seemed small but meant everything? Stick around. Because what started with one tree turned into a battle for the soul of this neighborhood, and they didn't just underestimate my knowledge, they underestimated my roots. When we moved to Redwood Hollow 12 years ago, I didn't think much about the HOA. The bylaws were mild, the monthly fees were reasonable, and most of the houses backed up to forest land, exactly the kind of place I'd always dreamed of Reyes. Sing a family. Quiet, wooded, and just enough space between neighbors to wave without needing a conversation. We bought the place in spring of 2013, a modest cedar-shingled home on a wide corner lot. One of the first things I did, even before we finished unpacking, was plant a young valley oak right in the front yard. Bare root, 6 feet tall, gangly as a newborn colt. I'd raised it from an acorn I found on a hike up in Rockridge Canyon, nurtured it in a tub for 2 years before finding it a permanent home. My daughter Sophie was 4 at the time. She called it Twiggy. She'd sit beside it in the mornings with her cereal bowl and say things like, "How tall are you today?" We painted a little wooden stake together and stuck it in the ground beside it like it was a headstone. I told her if we treated it right, that tree would still be standing long after both of us were gone. Back then, the neighborhood felt like a sanctuary. People had native gardens. Some kept bees. One neighbor had a beautiful greenhouse with climbing tomatoes and heirloom peppers he traded out of a cooler on his porch. It was the kind of place where folks brought over homemade pies when you moved in and left fresh eggs in little cartons on your doorstep. The HOA president was a woman named Martha Bellamy, late 60s, always wore floppy hats and played bluegrass in her garage. She welcomed us warmly and mentioned that the HOA mostly just coordinated community cleanup days and managed the shared irrigation for the hillside trails. "We're not sticklers," she laughed, "just neighbors looking out for each other." That's the tone it held for years. Meetings were short and half-attended. Most of the board was made up of retirees or longtime residents who were more interested in potlucks than politics. As far as I knew, nobody had ever been fined or cited. If someone's lawn got a little wild, a friendly reminder usually did the trick. During those first few years, Twiggy shot up fast, faster than I expected. She thrived in that corner soil, soaking up morning light and stretching her canopy into something proud and arching. By the time Sophie was in middle school, we'd wrapped lights around her branches every December and hung wind chimes that sang soft songs during evening breezes. We built a curved bench around the trunk when she hit 15 feet, and I carved our initials into one of the inner legs like a time capsule. By then, my daughter had stopped calling it Twiggy and started calling it simply the Oak. That's how you know a tree has arrived. It loses its nickname and becomes a landmark. My wife and I would sit out there most evenings, glass of wine in hand, while Sophie practiced piano inside. You could hear owls some nights, or see deer slipping between the shadows at the edge of the forest. It felt like a place you could breathe. Even when the HOA held elections and new faces started joining the board, it didn't seem like much would change. People rotated in and out. A few younger couples, a retired school administrator, a man named Keith Rudner, who always had an opinion but rarely followed through on anything. I wasn't concerned. I had my work with the county, and weekends were for pruning, mulching, grilling, and being barefoot on the lawn. Every season brought a new ritual. Spring meant remulching the root ring, brushing off lichen, checking for borer damage. Summer meant shade and cool grass. Fall brought acorns, dozens of them, more than we needed, but always exciting. And in winter, that tree held the last golden leaves like coins in an old miser's hand. One year, in 2019, Sophie buried a time capsule under it, a friendship bracelet, a photo booth strip, and a sealed letter we weren't allowed to read. She said she'd come back for it when she turned 25. That oak became a marker for E. Very thing. Birthday parties in its shade, chalk drawings that looped around its roots, fireflies caught just beneath its canopy. It wasn't just a tree, it was a pillar, a record of who we were. We hosted BBQs on the front lawn, sometimes with as many as 20 neighbors. No one ever complained. In fact, they brought folding chairs and asked about the tree. She's got good bones, I'd say, tapping the trunk. She's here to stay. But things began shifting, slowly, then all at once. First came a new HOA president, a woman named Jeanette Calder. She moved in from a bigger, more manicured development a few towns over. She ran unopposed after Martha stepped down due to her husband's illness. I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? HOA meetings weren't my priority, and Jeanette seemed polite enough in emails, at first. But you could feel the tone change. Suddenly, newsletters became more frequent, more formal. Language like property values and aesthetic cohesion started popping up. We were told that violations would be more strictly enforced. Landscaping reviews would begin in the coming months to preserve the visual integrity of the neighborhood. Still, I didn't worry. My tree wasn't a shrub out of code. It was a registered native species and planted well within distance from sidewalks, drains, and utilities. I knew the local arboriculture laws like the back of my hand. I literally enforced them for a living. But peace is fragile, and in neighborhoods like this, beauty can become a battleground. The first knock at the door came on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it to find a younger man in a neon yellow vest, clipboard in hand, and Jeanette standing just behind him, arms crossed, lips pursed. He said he was a contractor hired by the HOA to assess tree violations on behalf of the board. That's when I felt it, a tremor in the roots of my calm. They were coming for the oak. I knew the second I saw her posture, rigid arms, pursed lips, sunglasses on even though we were in the shade, that this wasn't a neighborly visit. Jeanette Calder stood with the same energy as someone about to file a complaint at a coffee shop over the temperature of her latte. Behind her, the man in the neon vest glanced at the oak and then back at his clipboard. We're doing a quick sweep of trees that may pose a hazard or exceed HOA guidelines, he said, voice flat, practiced. I looked at Jeanette. This tree's been here since 2013. What guidelines? She gave a tight smile. We've revised the canopy policy to align with best practices. Any tree whose primary growth overhangs a sidewalk or public-facing yard area must meet the new visual height and maintenance standards outlined in last month's addendum. She said addendum like it was gospel. I blinked. I didn't see that in the last newsletter, I said. It was in the attachment, she replied curtly. Bottom of page 4. We mailed physical copies, too. I didn't receive any such copy, and Jeanette knew that. The man in the vest cut in. We just need to mark this for review. You'll receive formal notice in the mail. They walked off without another word. The contractor spraying a small fluorescent orange dot at the base of the tree. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about the tree. It was about control. The letter came 3 days later. Certified envelope, letterhead that read Redwood Hollow HOA Compliance Division, like they were a branch of government. Inside, your front yard tree is in violation of Redwood Hollow Aesthetic Guidelines Section 7C, uncontrolled canopy spread. Failure to address this within 14 days will result in fines of $100 per day, beginning on the 15th day. Attached was a blurry black and white photo of the tree from the sidewalk. No mention of root clee. Arrants. No mention of damage, no evidence of obstruction, just the phrase, uncontrolled canopy. I've assessed trees professionally for over 2 decades. I know what an uncontrolled canopy looks like. This wasn't it. I emailed Jeanette that afternoon, requesting clarification. She replied within the hour. The board has made a unanimous decision. Unfortunately, we cannot make exceptions for personal sentiment. We must maintain harmony across the neighborhood. Personal sentiment. I replied again, asking for the certified arborist's report used to determine the violation. No response. Instead, the next day, a second notice appeared, this time taped to my front door. Official violation warning, final request before penalty, in bold red letters. My wife Maria was the one who saw it first and took it down. "This feels personal," she said quietly. And it was. I started seeing Jeanette's influence creeping in elsewhere, like mold behind wallpaper. One neighbor's garden gnome collection disappeared overnight after decor review. Another neighbor, an older man who kept a small windmill sculpture on his lawn since the 1990s, received a similar notice about visual clutter. Neighbors started whispering about the new regime, but no one wanted to speak up. The fear of fines and the petty enforcement kept people silent. HOA power isn't about force, it's about pressure, psychological pressure. It was clear, Jeanette wasn't just enforcing rules, she was rewriting them in real time. And the tree? It became her personal crusade. Over the next week, I noticed her walking her small dog past our house more frequently, always around 4 p.m., always with that same sideways glance, the kind that said, "I'm watching." She began including passive-aggressive lines in the community newsletter. Some residents believe their yard is exempt from visual order. Let's remember, we all signed the SAM-E agreement. Neighbors who once chatted during evening walks now crossed the street. Others gave tight nods instead of stopping to say hello. The oak's branches stretched lazily in the summer sun, offering shade to squirrels, birds, and bees, but now it felt like a target painted across the sky. Then came the real insult. A formal HOA meeting scheduled for August 14th, where Jeanette announced that tree policy clarifications would be discussed and violations would be addressed in open forum. It wasn't enough to issue threats. She wanted a show trial. That week, I dug through the HOA handbook, something I hadn't done in years. The original charter from 2005 had vague language about tree maintenance, but nothing concrete. In fact, it referenced county guidelines for anything involving trees over 15 feet in height. Guess who maintains those guidelines? Me. I printed out every policy I'd ever written, highlighted, annotated. I even found an email trail from 3 years ago in which I'd advised the HOA on sustainable landscaping. But Jeanette didn't want facts, she wanted compliance, and if I didn't comply, she'd try to make an example out of me. 2 days before the meeting, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months came by in the evening, a man named Calvin, soft-spoken, widowed, probably pushing 80. He glanced up at the tree and said, "You gonna let her do it?" "Not a chance," I replied. He smiled. "Good. I still remember when you planted it. Sophie was chasing a paper kite across the lawn." That night, I went out with a flashlight and inspected the tree like I was prepping it for a court hearing. No rot, no disease, no sidewalk encroachment, no overhang violations under County Code 14.3.2. I was ready. But Jeanette had one more surprise. On the morning of the meeting, I received an anonymous note in my mailbox. They're trying to use a new clause from the July revision. She's got Thurishishinna. He bored behind her now. No signature, no return address. I went straight to the digital newsletter archives on the HOA site, and sure enough, a newly uploaded PDF listed a July 22nd revision, one that wasn't voted on publicly. It included a single new sentence under Section 7C. All trees within visible proximity to public sidewalks must be capped below 20 feet in height unless deemed historically significant by the board. It was vague, subjective, and entirely unenforceable under county law, but it gave her just enough cover to escalate. Jeanette was trying to legislate me into submission. That night, as I pulled up to the HOA clubhouse, I saw the board members already seated at the front table. Jeanette wore a navy blouse, a clipboard in front of her, and that same smug expression. She looked up as I entered and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We're glad you came, Darren. We can hopefully resolve this tonight, for the good of the community." I smiled, sat down, and placed my thick binder of county tree code, photos, and annotated bylaws on the table. Because if Jeanette wanted a fight in front of an audience, she was about to get the show of her life. The room was packed, maybe 25 people, more than usual for a Tuesday HOA meeting. Most were seated in the metal folding chairs fanned out in rows. Others stood along the back wall, arms crossed, expressions cautious. Jeanette Calder opened the meeting with her usual briskness. "Thank you for being here. We have a few updates, but first, compliance issues." That was my cue. She gestured toward me without using my name. There's been concern over one particular tree whose canopy height and density exceed community guidelines. I cleared my throat. Would you like me to speak? She gave a polite nod. You may offer a response, yes? I walked up to the small podium and placed my binder beside me, took a breath. I wasn't just speaking for myself, I was speaking for every neighbor who'd been harassed or silenced under Jeanette's watch. My name is Darren Holt. I live on the corner of Cypress and Ridgeview. I'm also the head arborist for the county. The tree in question is a valley oak planted in 2013 and fully compliant with every municipal, environmental, and structural guideline applicable to private residential property. I held up the printed tree report. There is no disease, no overgrowth into public right-of-way, and no interference with visibility or infrastructure. In fact, this tree is registered in our own county's voluntary urban tree inventory. A few murmurs from the crowd. I continued. The policy Jeanette is referencing, Section 7C, was amended without a proper vote, and the clause it uses is too vague to enforce. It doesn't meet the criteria of enforceable legislation under HOA law. I watched her face freeze into that brittle smile again. But perhaps most importantly, I added, looking directly at her, this isn't about aesthetics, it's about one person's attempt to intimidate, isolate, and control under the guise of order. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a soft clap, then another. Jeanette banged the gavel. That's enough. We'll discuss this privately. But the damage was done. Her mask had cracked. She was on defense now. Or so I thought. 3 days later, the fine notices began arriving again. This time, they weren't just for the tree. A warning about my improper trash bin placement, a citation for driveway oil spots, despite the fact that my truck doesn't leak, an anonymous complaint about loud gardening tools used during restricted hours. I checked the community handbook. The restriction was 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. I'd been trimming at 10:30 a.m. She was using a rule book like a weapon. Every page, every line was now a potential noose. Neighbors stopped talking to me. One family that used to bring cookies at Christmas crossed the street when I waved. Another removed me from the neighborhood Facebook group. My wife got a tight-lipped apology from a friend at yoga who said, "We just don't want to get involved." The chill was spreading. Then came the anonymous letters. The first arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed in block font. Cut the tree or we'll do it for you. The second was worse. Your county job won't save you from the rules of this neighborhood. And the third, delivered on a rainy Thursday evening. You're not the only one who knows where the roots are buried. That last one stopped me cold. Maria wanted to call the police. I did, and an officer came by and made a note. Could be HOA drama, he said. We'll keep a file open. But unless they trespass, not much we can do. The word trespass hung in the air like smoke. That night, I installed motion lights, cameras, and a Ring doorbell. I didn't want to believe it could get worse, but the tension had turned toxic. I started waking up at 3 a.m., checking the window to see if the oak was still there. And every morning it stood tall, silent, innocent. But it was no longer just a tree. It was the front line of a quiet war. I wasn't the only one under fire. Calvin, my elderly neighbor, received a violation notice for excess lawn clutter because he left his walker leaning against the railing. Another neighbor, Luis, had a colorful mural on the side of his garage, a beautiful hand-painted scene of hummingbirds and wildflowers. He was ordered to repaint it, neutral beige. I called him. They're trying to erase everything that makes this place feel real, he said. It's like she wants a museum, not a neighborhood, B. But when I asked if he'd speak up at the next meeting, he hesitated. I've got kids. I can't risk the fines. I've already had to pay 3 ton. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the tree. This was about Jeanette clearing the path, literally, for a full makeover of the community. I pulled up property records. 2 streets over, 3 homes had recently sold above market rate, all to the same real estate trust, Calder West Holdings. Jeanette's last name? Calder. A Google search revealed her husband, Marcus Calder, had flipped HOA-governed properties for over a decade. There were whispers in city forums about soft zoning pressure, neighborhood sterilization, and controlled turnover. This was the motive I'd been missing. She was slowly reshaping Redwood Hollow, one violation at a time, until it looked like a marketing brochure for high-end buyers. She didn't want trees. She wanted clean lines, trimmed hedges, neutral colors, and compliant, quiet homeowners who didn't ask questions, and I was standing in her way. That's when the worst moment happened. One morning in late August, I stepped outside to find a branch sawed off the oak's east side, a clean cut, no wind damage, no animal markings. Someone had trespassed in the night. No video, no sound, just a fresh wound, and sawdust scattered on the lawn like bone dust. Maria stood beside me, silent. Sophie, home from college that weekend, cried. "Why would they do this?" she asked. "Because they want us to break," I thought. "They want us to give up and cut it down ourselves, to make it easy." But I wasn't going anywhere. I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office. I documented everything. The letters, the branch, the violations, the illegal clause amendments. I even pulled surveillance footage from the house 2 doors down, just to prove timeline gaps. I was no longer defending a tree. I was building a case. Because now it wasn't just about bylaws and fines, it was about trespass, it was about corruption, and it was time to turn the tide. That night, standing beneath the wounded oak, I made a decision. They wanted submission. What they were going to get was documentation, exposure, and accountability. No more reacting, no more waiting for the next notice or veiled threat. It was time to use everything I knew, every credential, every contact, every inch of the law. I started with the damage, using professional-grade imaging equipment from the county, tools I was licensed and cleared to use. I documented the branch injury. Photos, infrared scans, a cross-section of the exposed limb. It was cleanly severed, possibly with a battery-powered saw. I even collected samples of the sawdust in a sterile evidence bag and photographed the scene from multiple angles. This wasn't some prank or accident. Whoever did this came with tools. They came quietly, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I filed an official incident report with the County Urban Forestry Division citing unauthorized tampering with a registered native specimen under county protection. Because what Jeanette didn't know, what most HOAs don't know, is that there's a municipal preservation overlay on this neighborhood, and thanks to an ordinance passed in 2017, any tree over 15 feet, over 10 years old, and classified as a native species can't be altered, trimmed, or removed without written approval from the county arborist's office. That's me. I pulled the preservation overlay permit map, printed a copy of the GIS data, and highlighted my lot in bright yellow. I also retrieved a copy of the tree registration form I submitted in 2018, the year Sophie and I installed the oak's support cables after a lightning storm. It had my signature, my ID, county seal, time-stamped. It was already classified as a heritage growth specimen. Tampering with that tree wasn't just a civil issue, it was a misdemeanor. And if Jeanette or someone acting on behalf of the HOA authorized that cut, they were criminally liable. But I wasn't done. I drafted an internal complaint and submitted it through official county channels, not as a homeowner, but as a department head reporting local code violation and suspected fraud by a civic organization. And then I called in a favor. A former colleague of mine, Renee Gutierrez, now worked as the city's planning and zoning liaison. We'd worked together during the 2020 Oak Blight Mitigation Initiative. She owed me a favor after I helped her restructure tree removal exemptions near wildfire zones. I sent her everything. Photos, reports, the amended HOA clause from the July newsletter, and the 3 properties purchased under Calder West Holdings. 20 minutes later, she called me. "Darren," she said, "this smells like soft cell redevelopment. Can you flag it?" "I'll do you one better," she said. "I'll have code enforcement issue a freeze. Nothing gets altered or sold under that LLC until we investigate the pattern." That was the first crack. Next, I dug into the HOA itself. Jeanette had been citing her authority as if it came from on high, but HOA boards, despite their posturing, are civil entities, not legal ones. Their power only extends as far as the law allows. I requested the meeting minutes for the vote on Section 7C, the clause she used to justify the tree height restriction. By California state law, any changes to governing documents must be ratified by a supermajority, at least 67% of all voting members. There was no record of that vote, just a line in the July minutes. President Calder introduced a streamlined amendment to Section 7C, unanimous approval by board present. 3 members present, no community vote, illegal. I printed that too. I also reached out to a Freitas, And Mike Elson, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He'd defended residents in disputes involving solar panels, chicken coops, even a woman who'd been fined $2,000 for painting her mailbox red. I told him what was happening. He said, "If you can tie this to a personal financial motive, you've got her." I smiled. I already have. Within days, we had everything compiled. Illegal clause amendments, lack of public vote documentation, proof of registered heritage tree status, unauthorized property damage with photographic evidence, financial link between Jeanette Calder and Calder West Holdings LLC, pattern of fines and citations against targeted homeowners. I presented all of it in a single PDF binder titled HOA Overreach and Corruption, a case study in abuse of power. I sent it to the County Code Enforcement Office, the Planning and Zoning Department, the City's Civic Integrity Commission, the Neighborhood Mailing List, and most importantly, the HOA board members themselves. Within 24 hours, I received 3 separate calls from board members I hadn't spoken to in months. The vice president, Tom Brenner, sounded rattled. I didn't know she added that clause. She just said it was standard landscaping language. She's not just violating the law, I told him. She's exposing all of you to a class action liability. There was silence. Then he said, "We need an emergency meeting." And that's when I played my final card. I posted the entire PDF online, privately hosted, password protected. I shared it only with verified residents of Redwood Hollow. I called it, "The Tree They Tried to Silence." Within a day, it had 78 views. Within 2, it had over 120. People began coming out of the shadows. Old neighbors, new ones, names I hadn't heard in years. They left comments, shared their own violation letters, screenshots of passive-aggressive emails, photos of before and after landscaping changes ordered by Jeanette without approval. Someone even posted a voicemail, Jeanette telling them she highly advised they remove their succulent beds to maintain community symmetry. The dam had broken. Jeanette hadn't just upset me, she'd alienated an entire community, slowly, systematically, and now the evidence was live for everyone to see. And the oak? It stood tall, defiant as ever, branches healing under the late summer sun. I trimmed the scar where the branch had been taken, sealed it properly, watered the base, and mulched deep. Sophie helped. So did Calvin, despite his limp. He brought coffee and a rake. "It's a good tree," he said quietly. I nodded. "She's seen a lot." "But she's not going anywhere?" I smiled. "No, she's just getting started." They scheduled the emergency HOA board meeting for Wednesday at 6 p.m., just 1 week after I released the digital file, The Tree They Tried to Silence. By then it had been viewed more than 200 times, a huge number in a neighborhood of just under 300 homes. Word had spread like wildfire. Someone printed a copy and slid it under doors. A few residents taped quotes from it on community bulletin boards. My favorite was one someone stuck on the clubhouse door right below the posted meeting notice. "The canopy isn't the threat. The cover-up is." I arrived 10 minutes early. The parking lot was nearly full. Sedans, hybrids, a few pickup trucks. People stood in clusters, murmuring, eyeing the clubhouse entrance like it was a courthouse. Inside, the folding chairs were already filling up. I spotted Tom Brenner and Nancy Liu, both board members, seated at the front table. They looked uncomfortable, papers in front of them, bottles of water half drained. The seat in the center, the president's chair, was empty. And then, right on the dot, Jeanette Calder walked in. Hair tightly pinned back, clipboard in hand, lips pressed in a line of forced calm. She walked like she still held power. But her eyes darted like someone approaching a ledge. She sat without acknowledging anyone, cleared her throat, tapped the microphone. "We're calling this special session to order," she said, "to clarify certain misunderstandings and address what I believe has become a case of public misinformation." My name wasn't mentioned, but every eye in that room turned toward me. I stood, walked slowly to the small podium at the front of the room. I wasn't nervous. I had nothing left to prove, just facts to reveal. "Good evening," I said. "I'm Darren Holt, head arborist for the county and longtime resident of this community." Polite nods, some murmurs, a few folded arms. "I'd like to speak not just as a homeowner, but as someone who believes in truth, order, and the rule of law." I laid my thick binder on the podium. What's happened here over the last several months goes beyond tree trimming. It goes beyond fines and aesthetics. This is about abuse of power, falsification of procedure, and the quiet manipulation of an entire neighborhood for personal gain. A few gasps. Jeanette shifted in her seat. I opened the binder, projected the PDF onto the screen behind me. Slide 1, Clause 7C Amendment, Missing Vote Documentation. Slide 2, 3 home sales linked to Calder West Holdings, LLC. Slide 3, Before and After Photos of HOA Ordered Modifications. Slide 4, Heritage Tree Certificate, Valley Oak Cypress Lot. Slide 5, Violation of County Preservation Overlay Ordinance 14.3.2. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every word was delivered with calm precision. Every piece of evidence had a timestamp, a signature, or a code reference. I showed the clause that was slipped in without a vote. I showed the registered tree paperwork with my own county seal. And then I showed the photo of the sawed-off limb. Someone trespassed onto my property, I said, and deliberately damaged a protected tree. That is not only a violation of county code, it's a criminal act. And if that order came from this board or someone acting under its instruction, they will be held accountable. Silence. I looked directly at Jeanette. I've already filed a complaint with the Sheriff's Department, the Code Enforcement Office, and the city's Civic Integrity Commission. The investigation is active. I recommend anyone with concerns about their own property do the same. She finally spoke. This is a mischaracterization, she said, voice shaky. The board acted in good faith based on the aesthetic standards of the community. Standards which you altered illegally, I cut in calmly. Without a vote, without a supermajority, and while actively profiting from adjacent real estate deals. More murmurs. Someone stood up in the back. It was Luis, the neighbor with the hummingbird mural. He held up his phone. You fined me $250 for visual disharmony, sir, he said. I repainted my garage beige for that. Jeanette blinked. You told me to tear down my greenhouse or face penalties, said another voice. Stacy from 2 doors down. I've lived here for 16 years. You took my yard signs, said Calvin, standing slowly, one hand on his cane. I found them in your recycling bin. Then the floodgates opened. One by one, voices rose. Not yelling, just recounting. Calmly, steadily, like people unearthing trauma they'd quietly buried. One woman revealed she'd been cited for irregular hedge spacing. Another man said he'd paid $900 in fines over 2 years, most of them unverified. Several admitted they'd stayed silent out of fear. Tom Brenner stood next. I was on the board, he said, turning to the crowd, and I'll admit, I didn't push back. I didn't question the new language because I trusted Jeanette to be transparent. I see now that was a mistake. I support a full audit of the board's activities for the past 18 months. Applause. Then Nancy Lou. We need to vote on new leadership. Tonight. Jeanette's face was a mask of disbelief. She opened her mouth once, then again. No sound came out. I stepped back to the mic. I'm not here to lead your HOA, I said. I just want my tree. I want my neighbors to feel like neighbors again, and I want to make sure what happened to me and to all of you never happens here again. The motion was introduced. The vote passed, unanimously. Jeanette stood and walked out of the building without a word. Later that night, I stood under the oak tree again. The limb was healing. The cut scar had started to harden, clean and circular. In time, it would close entirely. Trees know how to recover, even after someone tries to silence them. Maria joined me on the porch. Sophie came out with mugs of tea. Neighbors passed by, waved, some even stopped to talk again. And across the street, someone had taped a note to their mailbox. It said, "Let the roots grow deep." The night after the vote, I slept for 10 straight hours for the first time in months. No late-night porch checks, no window glances, no imagined chainsaws humming in the dark. Just quiet, just peace. The following week, the HOA board held a transitional meeting, this time in public with full minutes recorded and accessible. Tom Brenner stepped in as interim president until new elections could be held. Nancy Lou and 2 newer residents joined as interim members. The mood was different, open, apologetic, collaborative. I didn't run for a position. I didn't need to. My goal was never control, just accountability. At that meeting, they voted unanimously to rescind all fines issued under the illegally amended Section 7C, remove all references to unapproved canopy size from the guidelines, RESI, tore any landscaping or structures removed under questionable citations, create a committee for environmental preservation and heritage documentation. They also issued a public letter of apology to me, to Maria, to Sophie, to Calvin, to Luis, and to every resident who had been threatened, fined, or silenced. The letter was signed by every current board member, except one. Jeanette Calder's name was absent, because as it turns out, she wouldn't be returning. 2 days after the public vote, Jeanette formally resigned from the HOA board. According to a brief email forwarded to the board, she had other projects requiring attention and would be stepping back from civic involvement. But that wasn't the end of it. The city's Civic Integrity Commission took up the complaint I filed, and after a brief inquiry, Calder West Holdings LLC was flagged for suspicious acquisition practices, including exploiting HOA rules to force aesthetic conformity and drive homeowner turnover. The company is now under audit. And as for the trespass and tree damage case, the sheriff's department confirmed they had enough evidence to proceed. A contractor, hired by the HOA under Jeanette's direction, admitted to cutting the limb after being shown the photos and badge camera footage from the mailbox cameras across the street. He took a plea deal, paid a fine, and in his statement he confessed that the HOA president told me it was a community violation that had to be dealt with quietly. It's not a jail sentence, but it's a legal paper trail that won't disappear. Jeanette may never face jail time, but she'll never be allowed to serve on a city board or HOA again. And her real estate ventures, let's just say the spotlight isn't good for business. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the neighborhood. People began to step outside again. Sidewalk conversations returned. Wind chimes reappeared. Calvin's yard signs were back in his soil by the weekend. Luis repainted his mural in full color, and this time it wrapped around the garage like a light. Ving postcard, hummingbirds, wildflowers, and in the center a strong oak tree towering over it all. He named it La Raíz Firme, the firm root. The oak in my front yard, Sophie's tree, the one we called Twiggy all those years ago, grew another 2 inches by fall. The wound on the eastern limb sealed itself in a clean oval of new bark, like a scar with a story behind it. In October, the Environmental Subcommittee invited me to help draft new neighborhood bylaws, ones that honored native flora, protected heritage trees, and encouraged sustainable gardening practices. I accepted, but only under one condition: that the tree itself be included, formally recognized in the neighborhood's charter as a protected landmark, a symbol not just of biology, but of resilience. And they agreed. So now, on paper and in the soil, that tree is permanent. Sophie visited again just before Thanksgiving. She ran her fingers over the bark, just like she used to, and smiled. "It looks stronger," she said. "It is," I told her. "So are you," she added. And you know what? She was right. I used to think standing up to people like Jeanette was about credentials and titles, about county policies, binders, and hard evidence. But what I learned was simpler and harder. It's about memory. It's about what we don't let people take from us, even when they try to shame us, fine us, isolate us, or bulldoze us into submission. It's about knowing that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay rooted. So here we are. The oak still stands, the grass still grows, the neighbors wave again, the garden thrives, the wind carries birdsong instead of whispers, and that little orange paint mark at the base of the tree, gone. I scrubbed it off myself with Sophie's help. She laughed. Looks like the last stain of that mess is finally gone. And for the record, Betty, the neighborhood chicken we named after my late aunt who first taught me how to prune, just laid her 500th egg. And I just laid down the law. They tried to cut down my tree. What they lost was their grip. HOA power only works if you believe it's bigger than you. I reminded them, some roots go deeper. I protected this tree like I protect everything that matters, quietly, patiently, and completely. Not every battle is loud. Sometimes it starts with a notice taped to your door and ends with a legacy preserved in bark and roots. They thought I'd fold. They thought the rules they twisted would scare me into submission. But trees, real trees, don't back down. They bend, they endure. And when the storm passes, they're still standing. If you're watching this because you're facing pressure from an HOA or a neighbor who thinks their clipboard gives them control over your life, remember this. You are not powerless. You have rights. You have a voice. And you might